Airman Jackson. I could feel the G-force lessen as I pulled out of one last turn, breathing a sigh of relief. We had only been in this fight for 20 minutes, and I was damn proud of how humanity's fighting force was holding up compared to the overwhelming numbers that we were facing. I watched as my WSO locked onto an enemy fighter, lighting its engine up with the minigun, only to be swiftly followed up with a missile that crippled the craft. As I saw the light fade from its engines, I quickly pulled into another hairpin turn to miss some munitions coming our way. I looked back at the fighter that shot at us to see that had been swarmed by Terran forces, destroying the fighter in the process. I let go of the breath that I wasn't even aware I was holding. What's that put our kill count to now? I breathed into the mic, keeping my eyes peeled for any more contacts that wanted to mess with us specifically. That puts us at 75. My WSO replied proudly as he checked the kill counter helpfully displayed by the computer system. If we survive this mission, I'm sure they'll have to put us in a Hall of Fame for this shit. We're big damn heroes, always had been as far as I'm concerned. There was silence for a moment. Damn right we are, I replied as we pulled into another hairpin turn to go after another hostile that was getting a bit too close for comfort to the double. Shit, we're out of flares and missiles, he said as he opened with the minigun on another hostile, causing a hull breach that would kill the occupants if they weren't wearing a suit. This is Blue Eagle 37 requesting a resupply run, he said into the radio. Acknowledged, came the reply. Proceed to resupply Hangar 10. Proceeding along the route, he said as I directed our fighter to the correct hangar. We didn't run into any resistance on the way back because they had to focus down our much smaller and more agile fighters. After a minute of flying, we were finally in sight of our goal, a heavily fortified and defended hangar that was primarily used for refueling and rearming fighters in the middle of a battle. We had never used it before today, but due to the 3 times that we had used it in the last 20 minutes, I was confident that it would rearm us so long as there were missiles to be fired and flares to be used. We flew past the point defense turrets that would shred any unauthorized visitors to the carrier with extreme efficiency and prejudice. We were forced forward into our harnesses as our ship was caught by an auto-fab system that started refueling and rearming at a prodigious rate. Knowing from the experience of the last 3 goes we've had, this would only take a minute. I looked around to see dozens of other fighters also in here with us going through the exact same process. Thank God for auto-fabs, this would take forever otherwise, I said to no one as I zoned out for these precious moments out of combat. One of the best inventions humanity's ever come up with. Perhaps not as important as the jump drive, but still extremely important, replied my WSO. He glanced over at me before quickly doing a double take. What the hell are you doing? He suddenly shouted, knocking me out of my Exen-like state. What do you, I said as I saw my finger resting on the fighter's dispensary control panel. I quickly scrolled through the many injections that I had accidentally given myself, all of it adrenaline, and thankfully none of the other combat stimulants that I could have stuck myself with. I guess this has taken more of a toll on me than I thought. My WSO shook his head in disgust. You're sure as shit lucky that you didn't inject yourself with some good old-fashioned meth. I looked back at him in shock. They put meth in this shit? I hurriedly looked back to the control panel. God, you're fucking hopeless some days. It's a miracle that you even got out of flight school, he said, throwing his hands up in the air. I shrugged. I've got it where it counts. Got us through this battle good enough so far. I could already feel my hands start to shake as the adrenaline got into my system properly. That doesn't change the fact that if you're going to be flying this thing, you can't be hopped up on drugs. Well, they wouldn't put it in there if there wasn't at least some justification for it, I shouted back. He shook his head. We'll debate the morality of combat stims more once we're not in mortal danger. Deal? Deal.
Hi, Commander Thegath. I watched the live footage that we were getting from the space battle all around us. It seemed that despite their diminutive size, they still managed to put up a fight that some species in the galaxy couldn't possibly match. I watched with great interest as a group of their tiny fighters followed up on a volley lobbed by one of their corvettes, destroying the engine of a battleship in the process. A volley of shots coming from the strength through diplomacy disabled another battleship. It's impressive how well they are doing despite never fighting us before. It seems like we will have to upgrade the armor on all our ships, but that won't stop us from winning the day through sheer numbers alone. I stopped focusing on that long enough to see a swarm of ships coming and going out of several hangars on the Terran carrier. That must be where they rearm their ships. I highlighted one of the larger hangars. Have 6 attack groups make a bombing run on this portion of their carrier. We will declaw these insects before landing the killing blow. Once we have neutralized their carrier, we will begin the boarding operations on the strength through diplomacy. At your command, High Commander. I watched the bombers begin their attack run with an intensity that could melt ship hulls. One of the corvettes tried to intercept the bombers, but there were simply too many of them to be stopped completely. Terran fighters joined in to attack the bombers, destroying several of them in the process. But like the corvette, there were too many to be stopped. The point defense turrets were the next obstacle for the bombers to defeat, and some of them even went so far as to shoot missiles at the turrets to give them something to shoot at that wasn't them. Clever. I'll have to promote the ones that came up with that idea, assuming they survive the rest of the run. My focus got more and more consumed by the display as the bombers got closer to their target. It seemed like the closer that they got to the hangar, the more fiercely the Terrans would fight, some even going so far as to crash their fighters into the bombers to stop them from getting to their destination. These vermin would make a good fodder species for the next war after this.
Captain Koshal. I looked on in horror as the Elean bombers made their slow and ponderous march towards the Rabbit's Foot. Our fighters and point defense turrets were doing their best to deter their advance towards us, but there were simply too many of them to be stopped. My heart lurched in fear as I saw the first bombers drop their payload into one of the 10 resupply hangars, presumably incinerating everything inside of it. The shockwave came a second later, shaking the Rabbit's Foot to its very core and causing everyone that wasn't sitting or holding onto something to take a tumble to the ground. "Shit! Status report!" I shouted to the bridge crew. "Massive detonation in resupply hangar 10 and massive decompression on the surrounding decks," shouted one of the engineers between his own fits of swearing. "Any casualties?" I asked. 37 fighters were in there when the bombs went off, and the entire support crew, sending in a rescue team, said one of the medical personnel. I nodded and signaled for the evacuation of that portion of the ship, just as I was warned of no less than 15 separate bombing groups coming after the rest of the resupply hangars. I spared a moment to look at the clock the Admiral had set up with the sinking feeling that we weren't going to make it. 22 minutes.
Alex. I looked on in horror at the long-range sensors on the bridge of the shooting star. I had thought that the lack of QE communications coming from the central node on the strength through diplomacy meant that someone had just attacked the ship, but I had no idea the magnitude of the opposing force. I couldn't help but feel more helpless than I had in my entire life as I watched the escort ships being pummeled by Yalayan forces. Holy shit, I softly mumbled to myself as I slowly sank to my knees. I had always assumed that when humanity inevitably got into a war with aliens, that we would have a grand old time of smashing their fleets and forcing a surrender out of their governing body. That impression was only helped by the successful capturing of the Indomitable Crusade not even 2 days ago, with nothing more than a squad of Marines and a mech squad. The very idea that humanity was caught this flat-footed and unprepared was completely anathema to everything that I had come to believe, and yet it was happening. But that wasn't what I was focused on. There was something else nagging at the back of my mind. "This is all your fault," the traitor in my own head loudly shouted. "All this death and destruction wouldn't have happened if you hadn't taken this job." I shook my head, desperately trying to rid myself of those thoughts, but they only came back louder. "This is all your fault. You deserve nothing more than to be executed by the first Terran that sees you." I shook my head more vigorously, desperation getting fiercer as the seconds ticked by and I saw yet another bombing run on the Terran carrier. It's all over, I thought to myself as I closed my eyes and started giving in to the despair. Before I could sink too far into that black void, I felt an immense pressure on my back. Looking up, I saw Eva standing above me with a concerned look in her eye, one hand covering my back. The captain, of course, was also looking at me concerned. "Are you all right?" Eva asked as she removed her hand and took a seat next to me. "What the hell do you think?" I spat back as I watched yet another successful bombing run. "This is all my fault, and I'd be lucky if High Command thinks that summary execution is a fitting punishment for me." "What do you mean?" she asked, concern and confusion mixing on her face. I scoffed at her naivety. "There are worse things than death." "That may be true," the captain spoke up. but we still need to get you to your people regardless of what they think of you." I nodded along, pretending to listen to what she was saying. Could just fake my own death. Wouldn't be that hard to say that I accidentally got blown out of an airlock during routine maintenance. The captain flicked her tentacles in disagreement. "There's no way that we can do something like that without several green flags being thrown up immediately." "Perhaps," I said, as I stared at the screen in despair. "Either way, I'm as screwed as those guys are."
Captain Koshal. "Shit, damage report," I shouted as the next wave of bombers found their targets. The inevitability of our actions became more and more real to me as the longer time went on. "We will not go quietly," I silently resolved. "The last bombing run took out the last of the resupply hangars," replied one of the engineers. "Those fighters are on their own now." I nodded and sent that report to the Admiral. "What's our point defense system looking like?" "The system is operating at 45% efficiency," came the reply from another engineer, eliciting another swear from me. "Current projections put us at combat ineffective in less than 5 minutes." I nodded. "And what of our fighters?" "We are at 70% combat effectiveness." The man stopped for a moment to catch his breath. We both watched in horror as one of the fighters that was out of ammo decided to make the ultimate sacrifice, plowing directly into a battleship's main gun. 69%, the officer said, wincing. I leaned back in my chair as I considered our options. We could keep going at the rate that we are, and be dead in the water in 5 minutes, assuming that the enemy doesn't want to keep hammering us like they have. That gives us less than 5 minutes to as much damage as we can, and keep the strength through diplomacy safe for as long as we can. Or, another thought crossed my mind. I activated the intercom system, paging the head engineer. "Macmillan, you still there?" "Fortunately, sir, yes we are. What do you need?" came the reply. "How long would it take your team to rig the reactor to go critical?" There was silence on the other end, only broken by the sound of sparks of electricity in whatever part of the ship he was in. "Sir, did I hear that right? You want to blow the ship?" "It's not my first choice, and scuttling it wouldn't do enough damage, but how long would it take you?" I asked as the ship got rammed with another barrage of missiles from a nearby battleship. A frustrated grunt came through the sound system as something metal was hit with what I assumed was a wrench. "I can make it unstable in 3 minutes, but there would have to be sufficient damage to the ship to set it off." I thought about the prospect of ramming the ship into one of the clusters of enemy ships I was seeing on my HUD. "Not an issue, just get it done. Keep in mind that if they keep hammering us like they are, we may not have 3 minutes. "Aye, Captain." He started yelling to the other engineers to destabilize the main reactor before the connection was cut. I looked around to see my bridge crew looking at me as if I was insane. I gave a heavy sigh as I nodded to them all and activated the ship-wide PA system. "Attention crew of the Rabbit's Foot, this is your captain. As you probably know, we are in dire straits right now, and I have ordered the engineering crew to begin destabilizing the reactor to scuttle the ship. If you are by some fluke still here in 3 minutes when it goes critical, then you will die a martyr in the eyes of United Terra and her people. All hands, abandon ship." As the alarm bells of the ship started to blare as I heard shouting from people to get to their escape pods. The navigator plotted a course into the heart of the nearest cluster before giving me a nod and rushing off to his escape pod. I momentarily considered joining him before I shook the thought out of my head. Not yet. I got into a call with the Admiral. The link went through just fine as the face of the Admiral showed up in the holographic display. "Captain Koshal, my reports showed that you just signaled an evacuation of the Rabbit's Foot. What's going on?" I braced as another salvo hit the ship. "Sir, you got the report. We're going to be dead in the water soon if this keeps up. But there's room enough in the shallow grave being dug for us, and they don't have the luxury of refusing our hospitality, sir." The Admiral thought for a moment, considering the options. He nodded solemnly. "Approved. Get yourself to an escape pod before that tub explodes. You're too good of a captain to go down with the ship." I saluted the Admiral. "Yes, sir," I said as I tapped a few buttons on my console. "You now have fire control over what's left of her guns, sir." He nodded again. "We'll give 'em hell, that I promise you." I nodded once more before terminating the call and calmly walking over to the last escape pod on the bridge. The escape pods were a thing of beauty when you thought about it. There were enough life support systems on it that you could live a year in the thing, assuming that you could stand the seat that operated as the cockpit and main survival area of the pod. The outer surface was coated with the best light-absorbing stealth camouflage that humanity could come up with. All Terran crafts had these types of escape pods on it, for the obvious reasons of keeping the secret that we no longer needed to keep. After all, if a Terran vessel were to be scuttled with the crew still aboard, it wouldn't do for the crew to be discovered by the inevitable search and rescue teams that would make their way to their location. Getting comfortable in the chair, I slammed my fist into the ejector button and felt as the G's swiftly rose until the inertia dampeners finally kicked on and I was given an unrestricted view of the battle, knowing that the fate of this battle was no longer in my hands. I gave a glance to the clock that was routed to my escape pod. 15 minutes.